Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to this session with Deb Anderson. I first encountered Deb's work fairly recently, I must say, when I read some of her brilliant research on farmers coping with drought in the Mallee. I'm just trying to find, here it is. Deb's paper today is called Covering Climate Disasters, Exploring the Roles of Regional Journalism. And it concerns, it draws on a national study of climate-related disaster reporting in Australia and involves interviews with regional news media about their role in covering extreme weather events of the past decade. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Deb.
Thank you very much, Sybil. I will share my screen. Okay, I'll just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we live and work, which in my case, being in Glen Huntly in Melbourne, is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. And Victorian traditional owners maintain that their sovereignty has never been ceded, and I acknowledge their ongoing strength in practicing what is the world's oldest living culture. Myself, I grew up in far north Queensland, and up north is still very much where I consider to be home. Yet I work as an academic and journalist nowadays based in Melbourne. And like most southerners, as we call people when we're in North Queensland, what we think of everyone pretty much south of Mackay is a southerner. I saw Cyclone Yasi sweep towards the northeast coast of Australia via the formulaic feat of commercial television. This was a decade ago, in early February 2011. So in my Melbourne lounge room, while I'm trying to reach my parents on the phone because they live inland from where Yasi was expected to cross the coast, on my television, the news networks were screening live a suspense thriller. And hopefully we can see some of that here.
Evacuations are underway in far north Queensland as locals and tourists flee the path of monster Cyclone Yasi. Much of the Cairns CBD is expected to go underwater when the biggest cyclone in the state's history crosses the coast early Thursday.
By tomorrow, authorities warn it'll be too late to run and far too dangerous to even try.
This storm is huge and it is life-threatening.
Roads out of Cairns are choked with people fleeing as the tourist city braces for a direct hit.
In reality, we would like people to get as far south as possible, quickly as possible.
With the monster storm due to hit in just over 24 hours, panic is setting in.
We don't want to be here when the cyclone comes.
Those who couldn't get out by road hit the airport, with airlines bringing in extra planes to cope with the demand.
So it's a bit scary. I'm a single mother with 4 children.
Homeowners in low-lying areas face mandatory evacuations tonight, with predictions they'll be swamped by a 2.5-metre storm surge, which will affect 9,000 people.
We're boarding everything up. We've screwed down all the storm shutters. I'm putting ply over all the windows.
The hospitals in Cairns are also being emptied.
There is a real risk that the hospital in Cairns will be inundated with water.
11 planes will ferry.
Okay, I'll pause there. You certainly from that coverage get a sense of what I was watching. And so it wasn't just on the television, of course. The Metropolitan Press in their online and print offerings relentlessly were telling us how Yasi would wreak, and I quote, havoc, chaos, devastation and death. And for those of us watching on, but most especially for those people who were in Yasi's path, it was a distressing affair. Now, insofar as newsmaking is a largely rule-bound and formulaic activity, and given that the news media play such a critical role in communicating disasters, what stood in for news coverage of Yasi warrants scrutiny. Over the past 8 years, I've been engaged in 3 ongoing studies into the lived experience of cyclones in tropical far north Queensland. Each study is anchored in oral history and they build upon each other. and each is anchored in oral history, I guess, as a way to explore how people understand the meaning of cyclone, as well as to get a sense of their lived experience. These interviews, one study is conducted with community members, another is conducted with members of the regional media, and then that's expanded into a larger study to incorporate the perspectives of fly-in journalists as well. All of this is really relevant, trying to understand how the media makes sense of these cataclysmic events, especially because cyclones in Australia are expected to become more severe. Powerful storms such as Cyclone Yasi in Australia, but also Hurricane Patricia in Mexico, and certainly Hurricane Katrina in the US, have sparked growing concerns over the impact of anthropogenic climate change on extreme weather events. Around the globe, studies show that the frequency of the most severe hurricanes and typhoons has increased, whereas here in Australia, the research points to the growing strength of tropical cyclones and the fact that they are tracking further south. So a key question for me is how people come to understand and live with that risk of cyclone over time, especially in politically conservative communities, politically conservative regional communities, where climate science is, shall we say, contested, to say the least. This is Bob Katter country. The unabashed social conservative MP, Bob Katter, has held the federal seat of Kennedy, which stretches from Mount Isa north all the way to the Gulf of Carpentaria and east all across to Innisfail since 1993. Now, the first of these three studies began in 2014, interviewing community members on cyclones in their living memory. Because the interviews take a life story approach and are longitudinal, taking place every year or so over several years, they elicit stories of things that have occurred long after the television cameras have gone away. This amounts to hundreds of hours of recording and several 100,000 words of transcript. And that's in part because the cyclones keep coming. North Queensland, of course, is a region that is prone to tropical cyclones, and everyone up north has something like this blue tacked to their wall somewhere in their house. More than 200 cyclones have crossed the North Queensland coast since 1858, when official meteorological records began on cyclone, and an average of just under 5 affect that area each year. So up north, we don't really talk about summer. The stretch of months from really November all the way through to April going into May, we call cyclone season. So when Yasi hit Cardwell in 2011, many residents were actually still recovering from another severe tropical cyclone named Larry. And that's the one that's actually pictured here, Cyclone Larry from March 2006. It was a Category 5 storm as well. It was downgraded to a Category 4 just before it crossed the coast. So it was officially recorded as a Category 4. And like Yasi, Larry crippled local economies and left thousands of people without a home. And in that case, it included my parents. So Yasi is the cyclone that's still officially noted as Queensland's biggest storm, certainly the biggest one in living memory, because if we extend beyond that, then we're getting into the category of Cyclone Mahina, which is still the most, worst natural disaster in Australian recorded history in terms of loss of human life. Anyway, but that was back in the 19th century. But still today, some residents up north will say that Cyclone Larry of 2006 was the far more intense cyclone. There are intriguing stories of loss and recovery on Cyclone Larry as well as Yasi. Some people who lost homes spoke of not wanting to replace damaged household items with things that were brand new. They long instead for things that come with a human history attached. They're looking for vintage cups and crockery and old linen tablecloths and things that speak from a bygone era. It's a really interesting story. Local op shops certainly thrive on it in the wake of disasters, but you won't really hear much about that in the national news. And there are, of course, stories of harrowing loss and impact, things that occur long after those big media outlets have left. One interviewee spoke of how she and a friend had volunteered to help with shire activities to mark the first anniversary of Cyclone Larry. So 1 year on. Let's see if this will play here. I'm just going to scroll forward a little bit. Here we are.
I actually had a friend that I worked with through an organisation who, the week of the first anniversary of Larry, committed suicide. She hadn't been travelling well since the cyclone, and I felt helpless in ways to help her.
And I'll stop that there. So with all of the interviews that have been conducted for that study so far, trauma is evident. And that's whether in telling a story from 10 years ago, like Yasi, we have the 10-year anniversary of Yasi this year, or something that happened 40 years ago, such as, we're thinking Cyclone Tracy. Many of the people who I interviewed for this study, surprisingly, 50 is not a huge sample size, but about 10 people had also been through Cyclone Tracy in Darwin of 74. So trauma is really evident in the way they talk about cyclone. I have to spend several hours listening before we actually get really to the interview proper. So the interviewing does take quite a lot of time, and I think quite a long-term engagement in those communities. And these are with people who at the same time readily identify with populist claims by politicians that North Queenslanders are bred tough. That's what even this less conservative, less politically conservative woman, former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh, said in 2011 after Yasi, that Queenslanders are bred tough, and that Cyclone Yasi came on the back of severe flooding for Queensland at that time as well. But evidently, cyclone forms a cultural site where stories of survival that are both symbolic and literal intersect. And so just a quick recap, I guess, of some key findings here. So these histories are shedding light on how everyday people understand and struggle with extreme weather as a core component of regional identity. And I think as a basis for understanding how the media operate in that environment, and then maybe looking at the contrast with how others who fly in and report on that culture and environment, I think this is a really good place to start. I think it's important to get a sense of what the community, how the community understand cyclone and cyclone risk. What does it mean to live with that risk over time? And we can see that lived experience is hugely valued as a form of expertise here. And in that context, these interviews have captured all of this sort of reflection, but also self-reflexivity over time of people thinking about how much their own experience matters when, in terms of how they accept what people are saying in terms of climate change, and certainly accepting climate science. In both cases, whether it's climate science or one's own personal lived experience, they're inherently partial forms of knowledge on climate. And I think that's really interesting too. But also their experiences are recounted as a conversation. All right, so that study also captured sharp critique of the news media through which people received information on the weather and climate. Locals considered the role and function of the news media to be really critical, but also highly problematic in terms of disaster preparedness, management, and recovery. And that prompted the second study in 2015, asking local and regional media professionals to reflect carefully on the ethical challenges of disaster reporting up north. These are journalists who not only report on the communities impacted by cyclones, they very much consider themselves to be a part of those communities. So this cyclone study builds on a growing body of research on the implications of media coverage for disaster management. A decade ago, Leading scholars got together in the respected journal Media International Australia. You might remember that edition back in 2010. It came out just on the back of what was then Australia's worst bushfires of Black Saturday in 2009. And academics were calling for much more research, empirical research, that engaged with both the making and the impact of these so-called heaven-sent media events, all emotion with little analysis. But as for cyclones, which in Australia have tended to affect regions without very big human populations, research on cyclones have tended to be overlooked. There's not a great deal of research on this topic. And as for Yasi, on the one hand, the national rush to fly in, to get on the ground, to cover this event seemed like a case of the CNN effect. So you'll know scholars use that term to refer to the tendency for news, television news in particular, to cover otherwise distant regions only when catastrophes offer this dramatic footage of people suffering or of bananas going up in price, as the case may be. But in doing so, all of the networks were trumpeting their use of modern technology and online reporting at the same time as the language that they used to make sense of the cyclone seemed dredged up from the dark ages. Exhibit A. So Australian cultural scholar Stephen Murky, you might have heard of his work. It's absolutely fantastic when it comes to thinking about meaning making and disaster. It's a story that exerts a moral justice framework, and analysing that coverage, the fly-in reporting, state and national reporting on Cyclone Larry was really interesting for just how strongly that framework comes through. We might consider the parallels between so-called modern disaster reporting, which is an anti-democratic force that's whipping us into a frenzy, and the way that many other political debates, such as immigration, are discussed far too often in the media, discussed in that way. And on the other hand, regional media can rise to the fore. Regional and local media in particular play a unique role in fostering civic participation in public life, and they offer communities forms of constructive action before, during and after disasters. I can see, one example of it here from ABC. Here's another example. So this image of disaster, the destruction at Innisfail High School, made national headlines, and I've taken that picture from what was then Fairfax Media. But only the local and regional news outlets carried also the far more constructive report on recovery, when that school was rebuilt in a different location with a sports hall that doubles as a cyclone shelter that is rated to Category 5. It's one of only 6 in the region in Far North Queensland, so it's quite a significant thing to happen for people in North Queensland. They also offer forms of compassionate and supportive action. That's because the story of local disaster reporting is one of being local. And as we can see in the excerpt here, that can mean always treading a fine line. As Damon Guppy, who was then news director for the Cairns Post, said, "I still don't know whether I scared people or warned people." He was reflecting on a story that he'd written leading up to Cyclone Larry, which actually drew upon climate science and some expertise that very much he considered important for people to know. But again, he knew that it would have quite a would evoke some controversy in the local community. And this is another good example here, and I've chosen this picture of this cadet journalist Frank Russo from the Innisfail Advocate because he's actually pictured in the office that was trying to report immediately in the wake of Cyclone Larry. So the office in Innisfail got destroyed in that cyclone. Anyway, here, so Frank's talking, really just about, what it meant to be part of that community. And I guess that, he made him think carefully about the ethics of reporting on that local community. So the ABC in various studies has been singled out as a trusted and reliable source of information during disasters. And certainly we'd hope so, given that they are our national emergency broadcaster. Such coverage takes seriously the notion of the self-preservative power of narratives of identity. It's not anchored in spectatorship of suffering at all, or indeed in ideals of dispassionate reporting. Instead, it speaks to the emotional labour of cyclone reporting for local and regional journalists like Richard Dinnan, who was at the time a very loved member of ABC Radio Far North. He went on to Kimberley, the Kimberley region. This reporter actually called for, I guess, regulations, measures to regulate journalistic practice when it comes to the coverage of cyclones. And it was a sentiment that was shared by all other members of this study on regional media. Here's a couple more examples here, going back to Damon Guppy from the Cairns Post. These are journalists who approach cyclone as a historical constant. And these are newsrooms that are well aware of the fact that people's lives are dotted with cyclones over time, both through their own lived experience, but also through repeated media exposure. And they know all too well that that experience of crisis lives on for weeks and months and years afterwards, and it shapes their understanding of past, present, if not future possibilities. Okay, so interviewees in this study were stressing that the public, the government, and the disaster management sector need to learn how to distinguish between two types of media practice, if not two types of media, given what's happening with regional and local media. These two types of media practice between the fly-in reporting and that is done by those who live in those communities long term. Indeed, the significance of regional experience, of local identity, of the local and of local places as a response to anthropogenic climate change was amplified in both of the studies that I've talked about here so far. This last finding, this idea that if you can speak as part of that local conversation, then that can foster not just meaning making, but also trust at a community level. All right. Which sparked the larger study, the one that I'm working on mostly at the time. So this is a national study studied in 2019, and the interviews for this one are about to begin next month. So these are with reporters who are based in metro media outlets around the country, who were flown in to be on the ground and report on cyclones. Most of them have reported on Cyclone Larry, Cyclone Yasi, or Cyclone Debbie of 2017. So I'm really interested in what factors shape their heavy reliance on this universal imaginary of cyclone in their coverage, such that the news media can almost become like moral brokers in some ritualized war on nature, as we saw, that example with Sunrise on 7. But also, what of the impact of these suspense thrillers on community resilience for the people in the path of those cyclones, or on efforts to foster climate adaptation? Would new disaster reporting guidelines help shift the emphasis from disaster to recovery, for example, or enable greater agency for local community members who inhabit frames predominantly of victimhood? And I guess in turn, I'd like to point out that a focus on compassion, in my case through using oral history, illuminates the value in expanding the field of media research on climate-related disaster to account for a wider range of journalistic experiences and to provide tools that enable contextualised understanding and critique. For if stories don't simply inform us about our world, but reveal who we might imagine becoming, then I'd argue we really need new narratives on natural hazards. Because for most Australians who are watching disaster news unfold, the real story is at once underreported and overhyped. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Deb. We've probably got time for one question before we have to wind up. I wonder if there's anyone who's burning. I've got a question myself, but it can be answered later. Has anyone got something they'd like to ask?
Yep.
Hi, Laurie.
G'day,
Go ahead.
Hi, Deb. Fantastic presentation. Really, really enjoyed it. I've just got a question about people you're interviewing in the study. Have you included any of the people who are running Facebook weather groups like the Atherton Live Weather, or any other groups that are sort of operating outside of the mainstream media?
It's a really good question, and the simple answer is no. So I've really thought about agenda setting. I've tried to stick to, you know, that idea of agenda setting. And I guess I've been guided by the way that community members speak about who the media are to them, who their regional media are. They all think about ABC Radio first up when we talk about disaster, and then they might start thinking about, oh, the tally was on, and then the power was cut, and then we, you know, for days on end, we just heard it through the grapevine. And so it's a really relevant question, and it's absolutely something that needs to be taken into account, I think, at all three levels here. Yes.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up with cyclones and looking at focusing particularly on cyclones. It's more of an observation, but I noticed over the last few years that the big stories that also seem to get now increasing coverage are East Coast lows, because they do affect, they tend to affect greater proportion of the population, and they play out for longer than cyclones. So have you done any comparative analysis of cyclones vis-a-vis other kind of weather events? And do you have any comments about, you know, what makes cyclones specifically the sort of focus of what people fear the most, when East Coast lows tend to do more damage over time?
It's another really, really good question. Thank you, Laurie. No, I haven't seen any comparative research done on that. I mean, it really is an under-researched topic, full stop. There's a wealth of research that's coming out of the States on it, and you could understand why, given what's been happening on the East Coast in the States. Yeah, it's another really interesting point to think about. Thanks, Laurie. I mean, yeah, you know, you think about that context and what people perceive. I mean, at the same time as, oh, we're bred tough and we just take it in our stride and we don't care, and, you know, but yes, very interesting. Thanks, Laurie.
No, thank you, Deb. It was great.
Laurie, I was just going to say before we finish, I assume you've seen Deb's book on drought, endurance in drought, because if you consider that a weather event, I don't know if you consider
we do consider drought weather events. Yes.
I thought you might. Anyway, that's definitely worth a look. Okay, everyone. Well, I think unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks for a very interesting session. See you later. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, everyone.